Today's video will make you look at history differently. What do you think people actually ate during the Victorian era? You'll be shocked when you find out what was on people's tables during that period of history. Here we have a Victorian-era dining table. What does it look like? Most likely you're thinking of either the lavish feast from Dickens' novels or, conversely, the dreary oatmeal from an orphanage. The truth, as is often the case, is much more complex and interesting. Food in those days was not just a way to satisfy hunger, but a true mirror of society, reflecting class differences, scientific progress, and even mortal risks. Behind the familiar products on store shelves lay secrets that manufacturers would have preferred to keep quiet. Watch the video to the end to find out how ordinary bread could be fake, how sweets contain poison, and why jelly was considered the pinnacle of culinary art. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of Victorian merchants, which they hid in the most ordinary products. In pursuit of profit, manufacturers and sellers resorted to incredible tricks, systematically counterfeiting almost everything that ended up on the table. It was an era of food fraud on an unprecedented scale. Let's start with bread, the staple of most people's diets. To increase the weight and make the loaves whiter, bakers unscrupulously added crushed chalk, gypsum, and even clay to the flour. Customers paid for bread, much of which was simply inedible. Milk also rarely reached consumers in its pure form. It was diluted with water, and to restore the drink's white color, the same chalk or an emulsion of sheep's brain was added. Such additives were commonplace in city markets. Tea, an expensive and prestigious drink, was treated no better. Merchants mixed dried leaves of other plants, such as blackthorn or elderberry, with real tea leaves. Sometimes used tea leaves were dried again, tinted with graphite, and sold as new. Even cheese did not escape this fate. To give pale cheese an appetizing orange hue, minium, a toxic lead-based pigment, was added to it. The appearance of the product was more important than its quality and safety. Candy and lollipops, especially brightly colored ones, were particularly dangerous. Green was obtained using copper arsenite, known as Paris green, and red was obtained using cinnabar, which contains mercury. Sweets were attractive but hid an invisible threat. Pickled vegetables, such as gherkins, had to be a rich green color. To achieve this, unscrupulous manufacturers boiled them in copper vats, causing a reaction that colored the cucumbers a bright but toxic shade. It was a deception that could be seen with the naked eye. Do you think this mass fraud can be considered one of the darkest sides of the progressive Victorian era? Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about what 90% of the population ate? For the vast majority of Victorians, especially the working class and the poor, food was a matter of survival, not pleasure. Their diet was extremely meager, monotonous, and dependent on the prices of the most basic foods. Bread was the staple food. White bread was considered a sign of wealth, so the poor most often ate brown or black bread made from coarse flour. Often it was the only food they could afford during the day. The second most important food was potatoes. They were boiled, baked in coals, or made into a thin soup. Potatoes were cheap, high in calories, and easy to prepare, which made them indispensable for millions of people. Occasionally, other cheap vegetables such as cabbage, turnips, or onions appeared on the table. They were used to make simple soups and stews, which helped to make the diet a little more varied. Fruit was a seasonal luxury that was not available to everyone. Meat was a real delicacy. If a worker could afford it, it was the cheapest cuts, trimmings, or offal. Most often, meat appeared on the table only once a week, on Sundays. Fish was a more affordable source of protein, especially in coastal cities. Herring, smoked or salted, was a popular and cheap food. In London, eels, which were sold right on the streets, were in high demand. Dairy products such as cheese and butter were also expensive. The poor could only afford the cheapest and often low-quality cheeses. Butter was replaced by more affordable lard or beef fat. Tea became a drink for all classes of society, but the poor drank the cheapest variety. It was a very weak, repeatedly brewed drink to which a lot of sugar and a little diluted milk were added for satiety. Such tea warmed rather than invigorated. Sweets were a rarity. Children from poor families could only count on molasses, a cheap byproduct of sugar production. It was spread on bread to make a simple but long-awaited treat. This monotonous and carbohydrate-poor diet was the main cause of many health problems. However, for millions of people, it was the only reality available to them. Their culinary world was limited to a few basic products. But if the poor ate so poorly, what was hidden behind the doors of luxurious mansions? Are you ready to take a look at a world where food was a work of art? What I am about to show you, you have never seen before. While the poor ate bread and potatoes, the tables of the aristocracy were home to true culinary wonders. And perhaps the most surprising and unusual manifestation of this gastronomic art was jelly. For us, jelly is a simple and unpretentious dessert, but in the Victorian era, it was a canvas for creativity, a status symbol, and the centerpiece of any dinner party. Making jelly was a complex and expensive process. The secret lay in gelatin, which was obtained by boiling calf's feet for a long time. It was a laborious process that required a lot of time and skill. Later, simpler powdered versions appeared, but the essence remained the same. Jelly was a sign of luxury. Victorian chefs didn't just make jelly, they created real architectural masterpieces out of it. Using complex metal molds, they cast desserts in the shape of castles, towers, Gothic cathedrals, and mythological animals. These creations amazed the guests' imagination. Multi-layered and multicolored jellies were considered particularly chic. Cooks painstakingly poured layer after layer, allowing each to set before adding the next. They used natural dyes to create bright and contrasting compositions. Fruit, berries, or even flowers were often placed inside the jelly, creating the effect of objects frozen in amber. This required incredible precision and accuracy. Each such dessert was a unique work of art. There was not only sweet jelly, but also savory jelly, known as aspic or jellied meat. Pieces of meat, poultry, fish, and vegetables were frozen in it. These dishes were served as cold appetizers and were also distinguished by their complex and exquisite presentation. Today, these traditions seem excessive and strange to us. But for Victorians, jelly was a way to turn food into high art, accessible only to the select few. It was an edible sculpture, the pinnacle of culinary fashion of that era. What if I showed you a time machine and we went to the streets of Victorian London? Street food was an integral part of city life, offering a quick and cheap snack for workers, clerks, and anyone in a hurry. The assortment was surprisingly diverse and very different from modern fast food. One of the most popular street foods was oysters. Today they are considered a delicacy, but in Victorian London, oysters were a cheap and accessible food for the poor. They were sold from stalls on every corner, seasoned only with pepper and vinegar. Pies were no less popular. They were baked with a variety of fillings, but the real hit was eel pies. Eels were caught in abundance in the Thames and were an affordable source of protein for the townspeople. Another iconic dish was baked potatoes. Huge ovens on wheels drove around the streets, offering hot and filling potatoes. They were sold with salt, pepper, and a small piece of butter if the buyer could afford it. Seafood vendors offered not only oysters, but also shrimp, mussels, and various shellfish. They were cooked on the spot and sold in paper bags. It was a quick and salty snack, popular with dock workers. There were also treats for those with a sweet tooth. Gingerbread, roasted chestnuts, and lollipops were sold on the streets. Children especially loved the ice cream slider, a scoop of ice cream between two wafers. There were also more specific dishes. For example, you could buy a cup of hot broth made from sheep's heads. This soup was great for warming up in cold weather and was very inexpensive. Which of these street foods would you dare to try? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secrets of Victorian pantries and learn how food was preserved in the era before refrigerators. In an era when electric refrigerators did not yet exist, preserving food was a real art and a daily necessity. Victorian housewives used many methods inherited from their ancestors, but new technologies were also beginning to change everyday life. The main task was to protect food from spoilage and stretch supplies for a long time. The most common method of preservation was salting. Meat and fish were salted in large barrels, which allowed them to be stored for months. The same was done with vegetables such as cabbage and cucumbers. Another popular method was smoking. Ham, bacon, and fish were hung in special smokehouses, where the smoke not only gave them a distinctive flavor, but also acted as a preservative. Smoked products were an important part of the winter diet. Sugaring was used to preserve fruit. It was boiled in thick sugar syrup to make jams, preserves, and marmalades. The sugar displaced the water and created an environment that was unfavorable for the growth of microorganisms. Drying was also an effective method. Fruit, mushrooms, and herbs were dried in the sun or in ovens. This allowed them to be preserved for the winter and used to make compotes and soups. For wealthy families, the advent of ice boxes was a real breakthrough. These were wooden cabinets insulated with tin or zinc, with a special compartment for large pieces of ice. The ice was delivered by special companies that harvested it in winter from rivers and lakes. The icebox allowed perishable foods such as milk, butter, and fresh meat to be stored for several days. This was a real revolution in everyday life, although it was only accessible to the wealthy. It became the direct predecessor of the modern refrigerator. Thanks to these methods, Victorians were able to diversify their diet and become less dependent on the seasons. Salted, smoked, canned, and chilled foods became a permanent part of their daily lives. It was a slow but sure step towards modern food culture. Want to know the secret that changed not only the dinner table, but the entire British Empire? That secret is a simple cup of tea. In the Victorian era, tea went from being an exotic drink for aristocrats to a daily necessity for everyone, from the Queen to the common laborer. Initially, tea was incredibly expensive and available only to the wealthiest. It was stored in special lockable boxes, and the lady of the house personally measured out the tea leaves. The tea ceremony was a sign of high status and refinement. However, thanks to the development of trade with China, and more importantly, the start of tea cultivation in British colonies such as India and Ceylon, prices began to fall rapidly. Tea became accessible to the middle class and then to the working class. This changed the social habits of the entire nation. It was during the Victorian era that the famous tradition of afternoon tea, or 5 o'clock tea, originated. It is believed to have been introduced by the Duchess of Bedford to satisfy a light hunger between lunch and dinner. Light snacks were served with tea, sandwiches, scones, and cakes. For the working class, tea had a different, more practical meaning. Hot, sweet tea was a source of cheap calories and energy. It helped workers stay warm and endure long, hard days in factories and mines. Tea shops and stalls appeared in every town. Companies such as Lipton made a name for themselves by selling affordable, high-quality tea to the masses. Tea advertisements were everywhere, and it became a symbol of home comfort in the British way of life. Tea consumption was considered a healthier alternative to alcoholic beverages. Various temperance societies actively promoted tea as a decent and healthy drink. Tea rooms became a popular meeting place, unlike pubs. What modern beverage do you think plays a similarly important social role? Tea was a beverage for everyone, but what was served when it was necessary to truly impress guests? In the next chapter, you will learn about feasts that lasted for hours. A dinner party in a wealthy Victorian home was not just a meal, but a theatrical performance. It was designed to demonstrate the wealth, status, and good taste of the hosts. Such dinners could last several hours and include more than a dozen courses. It all started with soup. Often 2 types were served, a light consommé and a thick pureed soup. The most prestigious and expensive was turtle soup, which was a symbol of the highest luxury. The soup was followed by fish. A whole-baked salmon, halibut, or sturgeon, decorated with elaborate garnishes, was brought to the table. Fish dishes had to impress with their size and sophistication. Then came the entrees, light dishes before the main course. These could be oysters, pâté, poultry ragu, or sweet meat, thyroid gland. These dishes were designed to whet the guests' appetites before the main event of the evening. The culmination of the dinner was the serving of the roast. Whole roast beef, leg of lamb, baked turkey, or pheasant were brought out on huge silver platters. They were cut by the host himself or the butler, which was part of the ritual. A variety of side dishes were served with the roast. These included various vegetables, several types of potatoes, and complex sauces and gravies. The choice and quality of the side dishes also reflected the status of the host. The main course could be followed by the serving of game. Dishes of partridges, quails or other small game birds were placed on the table. This was another sign of abundance and luxury. Next came the desserts, and there were many of them. Puddings, cakes, pastries, fruit tarts, and of course, the famous architectural jelly were served. The dessert table had to be no less impressive than the main course. After the sweets, savory snacks or savory dishes were served. These could be croutons with anchovies, cheese sticks, or mushrooms on toast. They were believed to aid digestion and prepare the palate for after-dinner drinks. The feast ended with fresh and candied fruit, nuts, and cheese. By this point, the guests were more than full. The entire dinner was a marathon of flavors, textures, and impressions. Such dinners were the pinnacle of Victorian gastronomy. They required a huge staff of servants, expensive ingredients, and several days of preparation. It was food as a demonstration of power and success. The Industrial Revolution changed not only factories and cities, but also penetrated the very heart of the Victorian home, the kitchen. The advent of new technologies and kitchen appliances made the work of cooks and housewives easier. It was a quiet but important revolution that changed the way food was prepared. The main innovation was the cast iron stove, which replaced the open hearth. The stove provided even heat, had several burners, and an oven. This made it possible to cook several dishes at once and with greater control over the temperature. The advent of the stove paved the way for new cooking techniques. It became much easier to bake cakes, pies, and cookies. Precise temperature control was the key to success in baking, which became very popular. Along with the stove, many new kitchen gadgets appeared, designed to save time and effort. Mechanical meat grinders, apple peelers, egg beaters, and ice cream makers became popular items. Victorians loved inventions, and the kitchen was no exception. Cookware also changed. Enamel and cast iron cookware became more affordable. Standard measures of volume and weight appeared, making recipes more accurate and reproducible. Cookbooks, which became bestsellers, had a huge impact on cooking. The most famous was Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management. It contained thousands of recipes, tips on managing servants, and budgeting. Mrs. Beeton standardized the format of recipes, providing for the first time an exact list of ingredients, cooking time, and number of servings. This made cooking accessible to inexperienced housewives from the growing middle class. Her book became a Bible for several generations. These changes laid the foundation for modern cuisine. Cast iron stoves, standardized recipes, and new gadgets were the first steps toward the world of cooking we know today. The Victorian era was a time of great change, and the kitchen was at the center of it all. For those at the bottom of society, there was one last refuge: the workhouse. Life there was governed by strict rules, and food was no exception. The diet in workhouses was deliberately meager and monotonous. The main principle of nutrition in these institutions was not usefulness or taste, but minimal sufficiency. Food was only supposed to sustain life and the ability to work. Any pleasure from eating was completely excluded. The basis of the diet was oatmeal or gruel. It was a thin, watery porridge, often served without sugar, milk, or butter. It was served for breakfast and sometimes for dinner, day after day. Bread was the second staple food. Each resident of the workhouse was entitled to a strictly measured portion of bread. It was often stale and of poor quality, but it was an important source of calories. Lunch usually consisted of watery soup or broth. The soup was made from the cheapest vegetables, such as turnips and onions, sometimes with a small amount of meat or bones added for flavor. This dish was more of a hot liquid than a full meal. Meat appeared on the menu very rarely, perhaps once or twice a week. These were tiny portions of boiled meat, often tough and tasteless. Fish was usually not served at all. Cheese was also included in the diet, but in very limited quantities. A small piece of cheese with bread could constitute an entire dinner. It was the cheapest and hardest variety available. The menu was strictly regulated and did not change for weeks or even months. Monotony was one of the elements of the harsh discipline of the workhouse. Every meal was just a reminder of a joyless existence. There was no fruit, sweets, or delicacies in the workhouse. The diet was designed to make life on the outside, even in extreme poverty, seem more attractive. It was part of a system of intimidation. The food in the workhouse was a vivid illustration of Victorian society's attitude toward poverty. It was not meant to elicit sympathy. It was a cold and calculated approach to the survival of the most disadvantaged. Victorian cuisine was full not only of contrasts between poverty and wealth, but also of surprising and strange dishes, many of which are completely forgotten today. Some of them were delicacies while others were clever fakes. These dishes reveal another facet of the gastronomic culture of that era. One of the most prestigious dishes was green turtle soup. Turtles were specially imported from the West Indies and cost a fortune. Turtle soup was a must-have at royal banquets and dinners hosted by the Lord Mayor of London. However, only a few could afford real turtle. Therefore, chefs invented mock turtle soup. It was made from calf's head, which vaguely resembled turtle meat in texture and taste. This soup became incredibly popular and even went into mass production in the form of canned food. It allowed the middle class to get a taste of aristocratic cuisine. The illusion of luxury was almost as good as the real thing. Another forgotten delicacy was larks. These small birds were baked whole and served on toast or used to make the famous pâté. Today, dishes made from songbirds seem barbaric, but at the time they were considered a delicacy. More exotic types of meat could also be found on the tables. Squirrel meat, for example, was used to make stews. Hedgehog meat was also eaten, baked in clay. Many of these dishes have disappeared because our tastes and ethical beliefs have changed. Others were simply replaced by new products and cooking techniques, but they remain an important part of history, reminding us of the bizarre and inventive world of Victorian gastronomy. We have traveled back in time and looked into the plates of the Victorians. We have seen a world of incredible contrasts, from fake bread and watery porridge to architectural masterpieces made of jelly and feasts consisting of a dozen dishes. Food in that era was not just sustenance, but a social marker, a scientific experiment, and sometimes even a risk to life. Victorian cuisine was much more complex and multifaceted than is commonly believed. It laid the foundations for many modern culinary traditions, from afternoon tea to precise recipes and cookbooks. It was a time of great discoveries and bitter disappointments, and all of this was reflected on the dinner table. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new episodes.